Hello and welcome to another episode of the Abington LaunchBox series on technology and innovation over the years. We're into episode 4 today, and as we've done through all the episodes, I'm joined by our producer and host, Derek Majors. Derek, how are you today?
Good. How are you, Peter?
I'm good. I'm both glad, excited that we're at the end, but I'm also kind of sad. This has been, I think, really a nice way for us to demonstrate and show some of the concepts that we talk about at the LaunchBox through our programming, through nice physical examples and stories.
Yeah, I'm definitely really excited for this episode. Also sad, but this one's gonna feature our most examples yet, and it's gonna be a lot of fun, I think.
Good. So again, thanks for joining us at the Abington LaunchBox and our YouTube channel, our podcast channel. I'm Peter Hornberry, the director. Derek Majors, our producer and co-host, and this is episode 4. Looking at video games and all the innovations that happen along the way. So Derek, as always, will be our guide, our tour, as we tour through these generations of innovations and examples. So Derek, let's get this ball rolling today. Where do you want to start?
Sure. So this time we're organizing the video games into specific generations. So currently we're in the 9th generation. But we're going all the way back to the first generation, and that is from the early 70s to the late 70s. And this generation had very simple games like Pong, and only a few pixels on the screen. Visuals are very much up to interpretation. In fact, it's just like a square pixel means a ball,
Yep.
And a line means a paddle. It's a little too old, the first generation, for us to have examples of that. But we still wanted to definitely touch on the inception of video games. And a lot of these consoles, were nothing like our current video game consoles.
Right.
The games were built in. In many cases, the controllers were built in.
Right.
We didn't have, analog sticks. It was just it was dials and sliders and buttons. And so just like a very, very foreign to our modern conception of video games.
Yeah, but also, again, as we talked about this concept of innovation, critical to what we have today came from something. And that's the reason for this series. That's the reason why we have these examples here. And to be very honest, games like Pong, it was a simple paddle that you could slide linearly, just left and right. That's the only options you had. It was on a dial controller, and there was a ball that bounced off of the walls that would be the sides of your screens or your paddles. And if you got a ball past the end zone, you scored. Simple concept, but at the same time, still totally playable in today's era. And even though we don't have a Pong system to demonstrate today, you can still find Pong in stores. It's still a game that you could probably download and play on a number of new devices. And I think that's what's really interesting about the video game genre that we're looking at today.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll find in every generation, there's at least somebody who's nostalgic for a certain period of games. And really, games of any generation can be enjoyed today with, modern collections of these older games available on things like the Nintendo Switch.
Right.
And things like that. There will always be, these games still have entertainment value.
Good. All right, so we're going to get into, we talked about the first generation. We've got some examples of the second generation. So talk to me about how things progressed from Pong into what is now the second generation and some of what we're looking at here.
Sure. So the second generation sort of spans from the mid-70s to the mid-80s. There is overlap in generations because generations are defined more by the technology, not chronologically.
Mm-hmm.
And this generation includes the Mattel Intellivision, Mattel being a toy company a lot of people have heard of and is still around, and the ColecoVision, if anybody's ever heard of that. But the games are still really simple, but more than just dots and lines. You're starting to see like more complex graphics. Still really simple though. Here's a game for the Intellivision, Pitfall, a very popular one. And as you can see, the art on the front is very complex, but that's not at all representative of the actual game. I don't know if this camera can see that, but it's just more very clear pixels. But you start
so
to
instead
see
of just one pixel bouncing around, now you had maybe 20 pixels, but they were cohesively put together, and you were able to infer that this is a jungle explorer, or this is a spaceship that's traveling through a digital environment. And that I think is really where the second generation, the hardware and the software advances, give us the ability to now not only control movement on the screen, but to also create characters, which is really then the foundation of what comes in the later generations of story and plot and character development that becomes something that I don't know we could possibly think about in the era of Pong, that eventually that there would be fully developed characters that exist in digital worlds.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of ball and two paddles, now you have an action hero swinging through the jungle and avoiding alligators and scorpions and collecting big sacks of money.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm sure that I'm sure this person in Pitfall probably had a name, but I didn't know it, right? I played that game on the Atari 2600, which was part of this generation when I was a child, but I don't remember that person actually having a name. But as we progress through these generations, some of you might remember the games, you might remember the characters, the names, and I think that's something that as this environment of technology begins to get more developed, that's when we start building in extra value, where it's not just movements of pixels. It is actually controlling characters through stories and environments.
Yeah, very much. These consoles are still like in their fledgling stage. Video games aren't very widespread adopted yet.
That's right.
And they're still figuring out certain standards, and standards are all over the place at this point. As you can see, this is what the controller looked like attached to the console.
So you had your base, buttons, but then as Derek is showing, you also had game specific controls that would map those buttons, and again mapping them with an actual tangible map and not a digital map where you have buttons that just get reassigned per the software. This was an actual tangible map.
Right. Yeah. Mattel just took something common like a numpad and left it up to the game developers to sort of insert their own controls, and up to the game developers to tell the players which buttons do what. And they can't unplug from the console.
Yep.
And there's other standards like video output and things like that just were, again, all over the place at the time.
Yeah, and again, as we develop technology, that tends to be what happens, right? There is no standard. We've seen this through the different series that we've run, particularly in storage media, how that environment changed quite from different size discs, different capacities, different connections. But at the same point, the job to be done never really changed. And for video game consoles, it was a way to develop engagement and enjoyment, fun. Right? The job to be done is have fun. And the standard format of how do you do that? What does a controller look like for fun? It can be anything. Although now, many of the controllers have a lot of similar functionality to it, because the pathway to getting to that job to be done of how do we create fun digital entertainment has become a bit more standard since we were looking at these things in the 70s and early 80s, and now as we progress into some of the next generations.
Yeah.
All right, so from here, we're going to jump into the third generation coming up. So give us 1 second to change over and show you third generation consoles. All right, so now we enter into the third, fourth, and fifth generations. We kind of are combining these things together as we go. So what era are we in now chronologically?
Sure. So this is early 80s through the early 90s.
All right. And big players, this is a big time for advancement. So
Yeah.
When we were looking at the original concepts, we're looking at pixels and very, very flat, kind of when we look back at Renaissance art and changing things like adding perspective so you could see depth in artwork and paintings. This is really a generation where everything changed.
Yeah. Not only were the pixels even smaller, but things were being paid attention to, like shadows and how like the everything was still 2D, but how the different what they're called sprites in the game look, and everything is just a lot more artful and a lot easier to interpret.
Yeah, and I remember, things like the PlayStation becoming a thing and advancing, but still these third generation consoles, things like the Nintendo Entertainment System and things like the Game Boy were where things went mainstream, right? This is where things became a pretty common fixture in households. It became, as much as you might have had a collection of board games prior to that, maybe in the 50s and 60s, this became part of home-based entertainment for the mainstream.
Yeah, like we've talked about a couple times before in previous episodes, this is the big jump, just like VHS was to watching videos or watching movies in your home. The NES was to playing video games in your home.
Yeah, that's a great analogy of the NES kind of being like the VHS player. It was really common, it was standard, and it really set the tone for what home entertainment systems were going to be. And I think that NES, Nintendo Entertainment System, is where this became something that was common, and it really set the foundation for further investment in home entertainment systems, which you can see, and we get into some of the next generations, that now there was a more clear revenue stream. There was a more clear entrance channel into households, and that spurred future investment, including now you start seeing entities jumping in that weren't part of the video game system before, entities as we get into that fourth generation, like Sony, who was really just an entertainment and technology organization, became an entertainment technology combined organization at this stage.
Yeah, video games were no longer a fad. It was proven viable in the market, and things are just starting to standardize. Just like if you've ever seen this, which is called a D-pad, controllers started to have those, and as well as standard buttons, and as well as things like cartridges instead of games being built directly onto the hardware.
Yeah. No, go ahead, keep going.
Still a number of cartridge standards. Every console had different game standards, of course. The Famicom, which is the Japanese version of the NES, stood for, or was a portmanteau of family and computer. Actually experimented with storing some games on floppy disks. Yeah,
right. And these are both Nintendo items. And what's this, N64? And this is a Game Boy cartridge, and obviously not compatible, but similar. And that's going to become eventually this compatibility, and as generations move forward, also backwards compatibility. So as we begin building more things like PlayStation 1, there's a PlayStation 5 in the background here. There was this concept of like, well, can I play my PlayStation game on a PlayStation console? And the answer for the most part becomes a clear no. So not only did we eventually have more clear standards, but there was still not full backwards compatibility as we go. Yeah. So moving forward into the fourth generation, we were kind of hinting about some of this. Where do we get to from the fourth generation? We started mentioning some of these things, but what was fully kind of in the next stage of events?
Yeah, so now we're in late 80s to the mid 90s. And this is when, we get another sort of small but still meaningful jump in graphics and such. In this generation are the SNES, the segagenesis, the Game Gear, things like that. Much more modern gameplay. I think a lot of people still, I think A lot of retro games like Pong,
Yeah.
are curiosities, but a lot of people still really enjoy playing games from this generation to this day.
Yeah, and I think this is, again, as we mentioned, when you look at the timeline of the technology being accepted as mainstream, I think part of the reason why there is a lot of nostalgia for this period of time is because this was when it became mainstream.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, modern game companies still find it profitable to make games in this style.
Right.
Because, this was the first big generation where everybody was playing, and, video games permeated regular society.
Yeah, and like we talked about, now we started adding things like portability, so the size of things became a bit more manageable, that you could process things again. Instead of having all of the games on one console, you could actually change out software, and that enabled some of the hardware to become condensed. And then we bring in things like a Game Boy, which is maybe not as revolutionary as something like a Sony Walkman, but still, I think there's a lot of nostalgia for things like the Sony Walkman, because it was probably, for many young people, their first entrance point into, this is my technology. This is the first thing that became semi-affordable, semi-accessible to children as their own. And I think the Game Boy was probably also not the family Game Boy. This was a pathway that people were starting to get their own systems. And again, not everybody, they were still expensive at the time. So it was not still something that is generally open and accessible to everyone. But also, because particularly of the size now, this became a pathway to have things become owned by an individual child. And I think that's also where some of this nostalgia comes from.
Definitely. Yeah, that it had a lot to play. It had a big part to play in popularity and nostalgia, because once it's portable, you can take it to school.
Right.
You can play with your friends. You don't have to go over to each other's houses, or God forbid, 20 years before that, to a physical location, an arcade.
Right. Yeah.
And then the last thing I want to say about this generation is that it just it sort of made the step from 2D to 3D a little bit. There were games that experimented with sort of gimmicks that made the 2D graphics look like 3D, but we weren't at 3D just
not yet.
quite yet.
Yep.
That didn't come until the fifth generation, which is the early 90s to about the early 2000s, with the PlayStation, the N64, the Game Boy Color, and the Sega Saturn.
Yeah. And again, this is where now you're going to see a completely different controller system. So now you step beyond just the D-pad, the left, right, up, down, and you move to some of the analog controls that have more fine-tuned function, because of that now 3D environment that was accessible through these new platforms.
Yeah. Now game developers have to deal with a third generation, or a third dimension. So you need a way for your character to move around and to look around instead of just walking left or right on a 2D plane. And so, yeah, the N64 and the PlayStation were really the first players in the 3D market. And this is when I got into video games as a kid. I played Super Smash Bros. The first Super Smash Bros. Was on N64, and games like Gran Turismo, and it was just a massive jump in graphics and again, popularity.
Yeah, and a thing that we often don't necessarily attribute to technology, but it teaches us new things. So even if it is as simple as, how do you now navigate a 3D world using one or two analog sticks, where you could change your orientation in 3 dimensions, was something that at the time we never really had to figure that out. But for many, this was the entrance point into now figuring out how to use different controls to navigate our environment. And what I think is great about video games is there's such a wonderful learning platform that there wasn't a book that you read, there weren't tests, or you played games, and by the scaffolding that was there to support you, you were able to progress slowly through games and learn. So Mario 64 was a game that you could play, and the the three dimensions were there right from the start, but the challenge was slowly and incrementally added so that as you were learning not only a new game, learning new controls, and learning a new environment, you were kind of rewarded for each successful advancement in the challenge, which is something that I think makes video games an excellent model to look at for how do you not only develop engagement, but how do you teach people how to use your new technologies as you go?
Yeah, and Nintendo did this kind of masterfully. No one was used to controlling a character in 3D, so they had to sort of create the standards.
Right.
So in Mario 64, the camera was taken care of for you. You couldn't make your character look around. It was all taken care of for you. You just had to work on navigating the three dimensions with Mario. And it really shows in their super weird controller here, but really innovative. As you can see, there's the D-pad that a lot of players were very familiar with at this point, and as well as the face buttons. And you could hold the controller just with the D-pad and the face buttons, or you could move your hand over here and use the new types of controls, the analog stick. So it was a really awkward step in the whole video game industry to try and teach players how to even navigate three-dimensional games.
Right, and to be fair, the Sony PlayStation did not launch with analog sticks. It launched with the traditional D-pad, but the sticks became required when you had games like Tomb Raider. I remember was a game that was really bringing in shadows and three dimensions and the ability to now look around your environment and then move in a separate input device. So movement was happening on one stick while as looking was happening on another, which enabled you to really fully navigate in three dimensions.
Yeah, and especially games getting a lot more complicated. The directional pad needed to be used for other controls.
Right, that's right.
Like 4 buttons wasn't enough. You needed a button to heal and for your weapon and for things like that. So yeah, I mean, the PlayStation didn't launch with control sticks at all, and in that transitionary period, they had to release it after the fact.
Indeed. All right, so we're going to transition from here. We're going to look at move into the, I guess, 90s, late 90s now, and get into the 6th generation. So give us 1 second to move into the 6th generation of consoles. All right, so now we're into the 6th generation of consoles, late 90s into the mid 2000s. We've got a lot going on now, right?
Yeah. So 3D games are now totally the standard. People are getting used to them. Games manufacturers are getting used to them. Controllers are becoming more standardized, things like that. We're really growing out of this awkward stage, the bridge between 2D and 3D. And so in this generation, we have the PS2, the GameCube, the Xbox, and the Dreamcast, which is unfortunately Sega's on the way out.
Yeah.
But yeah.
One of my favorite consoles was the Dreamcast, and it was awkward. It was kind of an interesting stage, but it didn't catch on, particularly because you really had the entrance of two powerhouses just starting to develop here. And they're both here. The PlayStation 2 and the Xbox were really starting to become the mainstays. Nintendo absolutely still 100% has a really strong presence, but you can start seeing that there's now a branch starting to occur at this stage, and we'll talk about how these divides are starting to develop, and you're going to see them really expand here over the next probably decade of time.
Yeah, video games are becoming a serious business, an incredibly profitable business, and if you can't keep up, you're done.
Yeah,
and some really important innovations came about in this generation too, like the switch to all optical media. On consoles, at least. Handheld still used cartridge systems, but as you can see, even the GameCube, even Nintendo has an optical disc, even though it's a strange format and fairly small.
Yeah, and even Sony and their PSP still was kind of in that in-between space, so they still actually were using a physical media disc, very reminiscent of, if you go back to episode 2, where we looked at audio, the mini disc is almost exactly like this. And you can see how companies like Sony are using some of their advancements, some of their innovations are becoming then built off of other different avenues. So the audio development led to the mini disc, which then also contributed to this was the UMD, Universal Media Disc, was what was used in a PlayStation Portable. So you had a portable that was still spinning digital media.
Yeah, as you can see, like the innovations of the time really shaped the direction in which the video game industry went. With graphical improvements and you can't do the graphics that the PS2 did or the GameCube did without optical media too. So
it was
they really go hand in hand.
Really important in transferring vast amounts of data quickly. And that's what again is driving this development, is not just the ability or the interest to play games, but the advancements in storage media, the advancements in transfer rates for data and processing speeds, and the ability to keep things cool and battery power. All these things are making more things possible. And the gaming industry, I think, really then is building on top of the advancements in audio, visual, media technologies to meld it all together into this entertainment and engagement systems that they started creating. Mm-hmm. So beyond just looking at the capacity, there were now some advancements, particularly the Wii, as we get into the 7th generation, went into a completely different area, right? So as we look at things like the business model canvas for businesses and entrepreneurs as ways to evaluate 9 different categories of their business, not in what they do as a business, but how they make money. It was really the Nintendo Wii that started this branch of saying, maybe we won't have the highest level of graphics processing. And they started to experiment with some new things. Talk about maybe some of the things, Derek, that the Wii was kind of the founder in branching off of the video game tree into a new way.
Totally, yeah. I mean, just like you said, they're trying out something new. Once the consoles had their footing in 3D games, Nintendo got restless, just like they innovated with that crazy controller we showed for the N64. They innovated again, and we get another absolutely ridiculous controller that's anything but standard. We even go back to, in the base controller, no analog sticks.
Right.
So, and that's because the motion of your character on the screen was controlled with motion. Right.
So putting kinesthetics into games, I think, became a really important factor, whereas during this period, particularly when you looked at PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, they were having this massive competition. If you go back and can find like commercials from the time talking about, the detail in their graphics, the richness of the visual quality and the audio quality was a thing that they were pushing very heavily. And one of the concepts we talk about at LaunchBox is blue ocean strategy, where typically there's opportunity and big competitors like Sony and Microsoft will compete in that space, and they punch each other, and there's pain there. But there's also this concept of blue ocean, which is while the big fish are fighting in one area, there might be opportunity somewhere else. And I don't know that Nintendo used blue ocean strategy, but as an example of what might that look like in reality.
Yeah,
that's really what Nintendo and the Wii did. They went out where they weren't producing super high definition graphics. In one of the most, at least memorable games, is things like Wii Bowling. It was the game that kind of came with the Wii, and it was basically just a sphere on top of, an elongated sphere with a bowling ball, and you bowled, and it is memorable. It was enjoyable. It was accessible, but probably not the same people that were playing games like Call of Duty and things on the PS3 and the Xbox models.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time as Wii Bowling came out, people were playing Halo and Call of Duty and looking for that impressive realism. And Nintendo found just as much, if not more, success with bowling and tennis. But and they were so successful that Xbox and Microsoft and Sony, both looked to them and said, "Oh my gosh, like we need to get in on this too." And out came the Kinect, which a lot of people may remember, but also maybe not, because it was in the end a huge flop and none of the games really worked very well.
Yeah, and it was really, I think, the development of when we talked about in I think like the fourth generation of how things started going mainstream. The seventh generation is where we really started to develop nuance in who is a video game player and who is a gamer, and the Wii really, I think, created that whole new target market, which was casual gamers, people that didn't necessarily care about frames per second or number of pixels or polygons that were able to be created by the hardware. They were looking for,
they just wanted to have fun.
Yeah, and it really opened up a whole new avenue of a market segment that just didn't exist before, because gamers were gamers. They wanted the newest, the best, the highest powered thing. And then the Wii came along and said, we don't have to be those things to be engaging and fun.
Yeah. Look, you can create a little me who looks just like your mom and dad, and bowl with them.
Right.
Yep.
And that's back to, I think, when we talked about the Nintendo Entertainment System, the words you just mentioned there, like you can do this like with your parents. Not that you can't play these other consoles with your parents, but we became, I think, brought family back into video gaming. Yeah,
and very much with the Japanese version of the NES called the Famicom, the family computer. Nintendo just wanted it to be accessible to everybody, because that untapped market of older people and parents, they don't want to play Call of Duty. They want to have fun with their kid and bowl and play baseball.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And before we leave the seventh generation, I just wanted to touch real quickly on handhelds from this era. So the two major players that came out in the seventh generation are the PSP and the DS.
Yep.
And as you can see, the DS still has that D-pad and face buttons, while Sony with the PSP actually included an analog stick.
Right.
Which shows that 3D games were just beginning to come to handhelds now.
Yeah.
The technology was finally catching up and things got small enough. And just like Peter said, with the optical disc in the PSP, technology made it possible finally.
Yeah, and the PSP was really, I think, a platform that had a lot. That is my PSP, so I'm probably a bit biased in the fact that I thought this thing was amazing, in that some of the peripherals that were now coming out as you got into third generations, you weren't just playing games on these things. You were able to watch movies, DVDs, and starting to watch things like Blu-ray, PS3 bringing out the Blu-ray of this is now an entertainment console. It then started to just push at the very end of this generation. You started to push into now apps where you could watch streaming content. And that PSP actually had a peripheral that would stream video content from your house. So I could take that PSP anywhere you had a Wi-Fi connection, and I could watch TV from my house on my PSP. And that was where I think, again, the seventh generation, you could do things before. You could still watch a DVD in the sixth generation, but this generation was where things got really blended together, having your Blu-ray player part of your PS3. And to be very honest, we're going to get into PS4 in the next generation. But how do I watch physical media at my house right now in 2023? The PS4 is the device that I use to actually play digital optical media at my house in 2023. It became the actual entertainment console, not just the gaming console.
Yeah, it's just super mind-blowing how these consoles evolved from simple video game systems to home entertainment systems. And even the technology at the time. I had the DS, but I remember distinctly going to a friend's house, and at a time when I had to catch TV when it aired, or record it to my DVR. I went over to my friend's house and he had an episode of Family Guy on his PSP.
Yeah.
And it was just I immediately was sad that I bought the DS.
Right, but that's the now the development of this is it's becoming more than a single use product. It has become, as we talked about with Nintendo Entertainment System, a full-blown entertainment system now. All right, now we're going to get into the next generation where this is all getting really blended through these next couple of generations as we get ready to wrap up with our last segment. But you're going to really see how all entertainment and engagement is being blended almost seamlessly together in the new world.
Yeah, in super innovative ways. And really the next two generations, the last two generations, the most current two rather, are just incredibly impressive and continue to innovate.
All right, moving into our final set of generations, we get to some very large pieces of equipment. Now we're looking at things that they're getting big, they're getting powerful, and they do lots of stuff together. So talk us through the 8th generation, Derek.
Yeah, so the 8th generation is early 2010s to present day, really. And it extends to the present because we don't know if there will be any more entrants into the 8th generation at this time,
right.
and very much because people still actively use these. You know, the 9th generation is so new that I think the majority of people I know still play Xbox One and PS4. In the 8th generation, we have Wii U, PS4, Xbox One, the Nintendo Switch, the 3DS, and the PlayStation Vita.
Yeah.
So things are steadily increasing in graphical performance still. And another important innovation is that we've gone totally digital now.
Yeah.
So that is to say the video signal. So here's an Xbox 360's video cable. As you can see, it's still AV. It's got 3 different components for video, and then left
Video
and right
audio.
sound.
Yeah, correct.
And the Xbox actually did have an HDMI port, but it was, again, just like the N64, that transitionary period. But now we're squarely into HD content and powerful games, and they needed to be HD because, like you said, Peter, people are using them as their home entertainment systems.
Yeah, these are the main interfaces for much of your access to all things entertainment at this stage, and video games are just one of the items on the menu, which I think is now why this is now developing the way they are, is that these devices are multi-purpose, multi-user, right? So that's something else that we haven't really discussed throughout this kind of development of generations, but we've also gone from player 1, player 2, to now, as you enter into the environments on these consoles, you actually are developing your own player profiles that you can not only have multiple people in your household that are set up, but as you migrate and navigate to your friends' places, you actually have the ability. Even with the Wii, you could carry your Miis, who are your little created people. You could actually send them forward to your friend's house to play with your profile. And I think that's something else that's starting to really become common. You see it in things like your streaming accounts where you have profiles for the different users, because it's not just playing your content. It's also considering what things might I suggest to you, because it's now becoming a fully internet connected device. It's both sending you information as much as it is collecting information from you. And that's all opening up an entirely new business model of capturing and sharing usage data back to the developers of these games, and the consoles is becoming a new revenue stream for these consoles as well.
Yeah, the landscape is changing a ton, just like we said, due to new technology. Faster internet speeds allow for data sharing and even direct download of games. You didn't always need a physical game anymore.
Yep.
Here we have a PS4 title. It's on an optical disc. But even in the previous generation, the 7th generation with the Xbox 360, I had downloaded games that I didn't have physical copies for.
Yep.
And now it's becoming a lot more common.
Yeah, and it's on all these media. So even the Nintendo and their entrance with the Switch, hard drive capacity or micro SD cards are becoming the norm. They're ways for you to capture, hold, and then play your content.
Yeah, this is my actually Nintendo Switch Lite, and every game I own on it is downloaded. It does have a cartridge slot, just much like the DS. But I just don't want to carry around games everywhere. Yeah. There's no need to anymore with the speed of internet.
Right. And again, back to why now you need accounts, right? Those games are licensed not necessarily to a device or to a piece of media. They're now licensed to a user account.
Yeah, definitely.
So again, as we continue through all these different devices, again, we're now going to enter into another level, right? So moving from video into HD video, you can even do things like full-scale VR support from these devices. Even PS4s, you can do that. But now, when you're looking at Xbox One and PlayStation 5, they're also becoming portals into another new and developing environment for, right now, gaming, some education, some entertainment. But we don't know where that next level is going to be, particularly with virtual reality is what I'm referring to, of some of the things that these devices can now process and serve for us to navigate through. VR is going to be something that also is an emerging interface for these new technologies as well.
Yeah, this is serious cutting edge technology this generation. They're doing incredible new things with it, like VR and advancements in VR. And a major thing, and this thread sort of relates to our other videos too, sort of all of them end like this. There's no more optical discs. You can buy a PS5 with no optical disc drive and go completely digital, whether that's streaming or downloading games.
Yeah. And again, that's as we've looked at this innovation pathways and the branches that come off of the different innovative processes that happen. Sometimes those branches end, and we saw some of the things kind of pass on. The D-pad still exists, right? So that's a branch that continues to carry on, but the cartridge is gone. The digital media is now nearly completely gone. Those branches terminate. It doesn't mean that they weren't valuable or important or still create value. It just means that the main branch is moving in a new and different direction. And that's things like when you need VR, optical media can serve massive amounts of content quickly, but not enough. Yeah.
And the consoles, again, are changing with consumer habits.
Right.
So before you needed your console just as much for gaming as you did for, playing your movies. But now consumers don't consume movies physically anymore.
Yeah.
They stream them. So, the PS5 is really the first generation to offer a console widely without optical disc drive.
Yeah.
So here you see it on this console. The optical disc drive is present, but I think it's equally, if not more, popular to buy the one without it.
Yeah, and that then pushes us to things. What's next, right? And we kind of bring all of this to you to show that we didn't get here by accident, right? These all have connections and pathways that we can trace and monitor and even be nostalgic and say, let's go back and play the Intellivision and remember what it was like to control a character that's made up of 5 pixels instead of 5 million pixels. And but it also gives us an idea of where can we possibly go next. And I think that's what's exciting, which is then, we start with something like this. Trends tend to be, they get smaller and smaller, become portable, and maybe something like portable VR can become a thing. Whereas now it's a bit challenging to do that. We'll see what comes next.
Yeah, and it's really anyone's guess, but just like every episode we've done so far, the trend is giving up physical media, going all digital, and losing things like compatibility and ports and things like that. Just advancing at an alarming rate, honestly.
Yeah, and the hope is that we still retain value from the past iterations of things, but we still hold potential value in moving forward. So that's how we're going to wrap up our series. So we hope that you've enjoyed going through all of the technology through the ages that we've looked at, from storage media, audio media, visual media, all the way down to, I think, the thing that encapsulates all of that really well together, which was video games. So again, we appreciate that. If you have questions, comments, things you would like to see from us in the future, please share it in the comments. But also thank you to Derek Majors for producing, organizing, bringing together. Most of these consoles come from him or partners and friends that he's been able to reach out to and borrow things from for this production. And I really appreciated his time, effort, and energy to put together, I think, a really well-organized and delivered program to encapsulate LaunchBox concepts into a very accessible format, which is this podcast and video series.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, it was a big joy to be able to share all of these things with you, and thank you all so much for taking the time to watch and just go through the journey of all of this tech that sort of shapes our modern day and how we interact with things and what life is like.
Cool. All right, so thanks again, all, and look for more information from us at the Abington LaunchBox. You can visit us on YouTube. We're on podcasting channels like Apple Podcasts, as well as our website. So thanks again. We'll see you soon.